And so it was a big deal for me to kind of walk away from 25 years worth of digital analytics.
Yeah.
But I'd say the biggest theme that I have in my career, if as I look back at it, is that I always like to kind of be at a challenger brand, if you will, and it could either be a company or a philosophy. Like when we talked about web trends, when web trends was the 800-pound gorilla in the analytics space, I was like, you know what? I want to take a chance on a startup like Omniture, who I really have a good feeling about. And Omniture just destroyed web trends. When I worked at Salesforce, Oracle and Siebel were like the biggest vendors, but I really felt like Salesforce had a good thing going, and I felt like they were on the right path. When I joined Amplitude, I felt like they were doing really well in product analytics, and I felt like someone needed to kind of converge these different analytics disciplines. And when I reached out to a couple of vendors, Amplitude was the one that really wanted to do it.
Well, Adam, thank you for joining me today on Couch Confidentials. I have to say, the first time I came across the name Adam Greco, I was working for a company called Conversion Company. I still remember it. And I was working for a Dutch telephone company called KPN. And there was the support ticket we had to open. And for some reason, Adam Greco was the only person always responding to those messages. But this was using Omniture Site Catalyst. So this is a long time ago. So for the people who don't know you, I've kind of started not introducing people fully, because I guess if they see the name, they'll want to listen because they probably know you already. And I think a lot of people in my sphere of influence already know the name Adam Greco, but I'm super curious to hear, I mean, how did you end up in digital analytics?
Yeah. Well, first of all, thanks for having me. Yeah. My career was a little bit strange because I was in the CRM kind of space before the CDP space, doing a lot of Lotus Notes. I used to build and program CRM systems. Lotus Notes was a pretty flexible system. And then I got into Siebel and then eventually Salesforce. But I ended up accidentally in the digital analytics space because I was working for the Chicago Mercantile Exchange, which is my hometown of Chicago. And I was managing the website when the internet first came around. And we were a pretty profitable enterprise at the Chicago Mercantile Exchange, but we catered to people who were trading futures and options. And I couldn't figure out why we even had a website, like who was using the website. Because whenever I would meet traders, they would say that they never used the website. And so I kind of did some research and found this thing called website analytics, where you could look at what was being done on your website. And I thought that was kind of interesting. And then I looked at a bunch of vendors and did a bunch of research. And that's when I found this new company that no one had ever heard of called Omniture. And I ended up being like probably the fifth customer of Omniture because I had a pretty healthy marketing budget. And no one had ever heard of Omniture. Web Trends was the big vendor that everyone used. And Omniture was a SaaS vendor that was one of the first to kind of put your data in the cloud. And honestly, when I met with the sales rep, he came out to Chicago and showed me the product. When I said, "Hey, it sounds good, I think we'll take it," his first word was, "Really?" Like they were so unused to actually getting customers. They had said the magic words to me that said our product was really new and still under development. And if I became an early customer, I would get to have a lot of influence on the product. So that really hooked me. And then I started doing kind of crazy things with the Omniture Site Catalyst product and started integrating it with the CRM systems that we had, Salesforce. And eventually they basically said, they're like, "No other customer is doing what you're doing with our product. We really think you should come work here." And so that's how I ended up at Omniture.
Oh, they really just because of the activity you were showing on their own product, they reached out to you and kind of hired you?
Well, it was kind of interesting. I had an account manager and then I learned a lot from him. And then he moved on to another, because when you're at a startup, people change roles a lot. They kept giving me new account managers and I kept knowing more about the product than the account managers. And they're like, "Our account managers are learning from you, like how you're using the product." And they're like, "This is silly. You need to come work here." And my first job was basically to travel around the world and just go meet with as many of their customers as possible and try to get them to do more advanced things with Site Catalyst.
Oh, wow. That's incredible. I mean, these are the Wild West days of digital analytics, as far as I can remember. I know we shared some emails and some names back and forth, like Eric T. Peterson. We have Jim, we have Stefan, we have all these people. And like you said, Web Trends was the biggest thing at the time with all their weblogs. And I remember the first job I had with conversion companies where I did get the training with with a job that I had around psych. You were probably involved with that as well, to some extent. And then,
Yeah.
but that was the kickoff. We just kind of rolled in it because it's not something you went to school for at the time. It's not something you studied for. You got digital marketing classes, but so
Yeah,
you ended up.
I was a finance major, so I just was always really good with numbers. And so it just kind of felt kind of cool to me.
That's an amazing story. So they were located in.
Yep. Yeah, and they actually wanted me to move to Utah, but that just didn't work for me personally. And so I ended up being the first non-sales remote employee at Omniture. And then eventually they sent me to Europe, where I helped build the consulting practice in Europe, since I was already out of the Utah headquarters anyway.
Yeah. And that's incredible because you did mention you do visit the Netherlands quite often. And I know Krista Seiden, also from the Google Analytics community. She does that a lot, but she's married to a Dutch person.
Yeah, and I purchased a home in Amsterdam, since I lived there in 2023 when I worked for Amplitude. So so I have my European home and my US home because I spend so much time in Europe.
Yeah, that's pretty cool. And that's a nice segue into Amplitude, because did you stick around for the acquisition with Adobe at the time with Omniture?
So I actually left right before the acquisition. I found out accidentally that Omniture was about to sell itself, and I had been there for about 5 years. It had grown, and I was looking to maybe do something else. And so ironically, I actually went to Salesforce, because Salesforce was one of the two companies that was looking at acquiring Omniture. In my first week at Salesforce, I ended up meeting with Mark Benioff to talk about the pros and cons of Salesforce acquiring Omniture. But as we know, Adobe ended up acquiring Omniture.
Yeah. Did that throw any kind of wrenches in your plans about growing out Omniture site catalogs as a product at Salesforce, or did you
No,
have
I
other
mean,
intentions?
it would have been really cool to be at Salesforce if they acquired Omniture, because I knew so much about the product, and it would have been kind of cool. But I ended up being a customer at Salesforce of Omniture. And for me, it was kind of fun. I had a kind of non-compete period with Omniture for a couple of years. And so it was fun to be at an amazing company like Salesforce and running the Omniture Site Catalyst, which then turned into the Adobe Site Catalyst, which then turned into Adobe Analytics. But I was there for 2 years, and it's after you work at like 10, 20 companies at a time, helping them with analytics. Having one company that I could focus on for 2 years, like we had a really, really cool implementation, which of course then many years Chris Seiden came in and moved it all over to Google after Salesforce and Adobe decided that they weren't super friends anymore.
Wow. It's such a strange business to be in. And there's a lot of names that keep crossing our paths. And I've had a few other digital analytics people on the podcast already. The two of her that I've already named, or at least one was Stefan Hamel. The other one is Brian Clifton. But I've also spoken to Sergio Maldonado, and there was a fourth person whose name just eluded me. But strangely enough, they've all been, they've all gone to the side of privacy. Is it something like inherent to analytics people, having seen what can, the data that we can collect and what can be done with your data, that makes them a little bit more wary about, or pushes them more into a position where they feel that they need to broadcast a little bit more about the potential threats or the risks involved with dealing with digital data?
Yeah, I mean, I think a couple of folks you mentioned are either Canadian or European, and obviously there's a bigger push for privacy. Here in America, we're pretty cowboyish about privacy in many respects. Yeah. But I do think that as we get into, I'm sure we'll talk a little bit about digital analytics versus CDP. But digital analytics, you got to remember that traditionally most of the data is anonymous data, because only recently did a lot of websites and apps start asking for people's first party data. So I think most digital analysts grew up in a world where it was unique visitors and visits and page views, and we don't actually know who these people are in many cases.
Yeah.
And so I think in the CDP space, you get a little more spoiled, where you actually oftentimes know who the people are. And so when you're doing privacy, when you're thinking about privacy, there's a lot of people who are anonymous, who choose to be anonymous. And that's why I think digital analysts tend to focus a lot on privacy, just because cookies and it's like I think a lot of digital analytics is trying to like track people who oftentimes don't want to be tracked. But what I always liked about digital analytics was that I always felt like a lot of the advertising, could get a little creepy, when you look at a product online and then it starts following you around. And what I liked about digital analytics, and I used to tell my friends, is like, I work for a company that has a website like Nike, and I'm really just helping Nike to use data to figure out how to make that website experience better. But then when you move into the CDP world, you're more into the, hey, we actually do want to build profiles and we want to be able to target people and personalize and, try to make it not creepy, but also effective for organizations.
Yeah. And did you ever consider going into ad tech or more to kind of the third party data collection of vendors? Or was that not something that you had a good vibe with, looking at your history of Omniture, Salesforce, and then eventually Amplitude, of course?
Yeah, I always really liked being on the client side or helping clients manage the analytics so that they could make their website or app better. With Omniture, it was a lot of website. With Amplitude, I wanted to learn more about mobile apps because they started more in the mobile app tracking. But obviously with my move to Hightouch, and there's many reasons for that, I kind of am starting to see that the data that we have about websites and mobile apps is really just a small piece of the data picture. And as we move as an industry more towards first party, I kind of saw the tea leaves and wanted to kind of be in a situation where I was in more of a first party data situation. And that's kind of one of the reasons why I moved over from digital analytics to CDP, because I want to actually see all of the data related to the customer and ideally have the permission to use that data to build audiences and do advertising. But I never really was like a deep ad tech person, like people like Rio Longacre. Like these are people who live and breathe ad tech. I think it's kind of fascinating. And I've done a little bit of kind of growth marketing in my time. But in general, I'm really right now focused on first party data because I think that anonymous data is becoming less trustworthy because of all the browsers and cookie deletion and so on. And so I kind of want to move towards where we actually know who these people are. And a lot of brands are starting to realize that they need to come up with incentives for people to tell who they are and give consent for better experiences.
Yeah, no, definitely. And I was, not too, I think Amplitude a couple of months ago made a great step with their in-app surveys and approaching existing users potentially with these in-app surveys to start collecting first-party data. And it's really amazing. But I kind of shared a sentiment with you around the move from digital analytics to CDPs. It's almost a similar kind of story in that you have that behavioral data. And sure, you can enrich it with qualitative data. What are they saying? You had social listening was a big thing. You had usertesting.com where you could also gain insights from how people are actually interacting with your website. But it was about building that complete picture of the users and what they actually wanted. So I think that maybe you experienced that same thing when you came across CDPs. It was like, wow, this is like digital analytics, but in its most complete form, because digital analytics felt so passive. You're recording the data, you can analyze it, but by the time you have any insights out of it, it's months old. CDP allows you to take action. With your move to Hightouch, when you kind of dove into the deep end of CDPs, what were the kind of the cool things you discovered about CDPs that you didn't know before?
Yeah, well, so I think, I obviously have known about CDPs for a long time. At one point, almost went to work for CDP called Telium many years ago. A bunch of ex-Omniture people are there. I think what really was interesting to me is when I was at Amplitude, one of the things that I really wanted to do at Amplitude was to try to drive a convergence between kind of marketing analytics, product analytics, and experience analytics, which is like session replay and surveys, and kind of pulled all that together. And I think it was really cool to do that because Amplitude was really open to that. And I think it helped push the whole digital analytics industry a little bit because you saw a lot of acquisitions, like Adobe got into product analytics. You've got Content Square who bought Heap. So I think that was kind of interesting. But then when I was at Amplitude, we also kind of started what I'll call like a lightweight CDP, because we're basically like, hey, we're collecting a lot of information. We have a profile for users. We could build audiences. And so we had like a CDP product. But I think what I learned in my time at Amplitude is that like CDP is one of these things that either you're all in or you're not, because there's just a lot of things like identity resolution and being able to do the complexities of multiple IDs and being
Yeah.
able to build audiences. But when you build an audience, you need to have as much of the data as possible. Otherwise, you could actually do a worse experience, which I could tell you some examples I encountered of that. But I think ultimately, even Amplitude would admit that like they're kind of not really pushing themselves as a full CDP. I think they have just audiences that you could activate, but with data that you get from website, mobile app, and surveys. But it gave me a little bit of a taste. And it also gave me a taste of like, as Amplitude started looking at doing more things that are more warehouse native, like querying data that was directly in Snowflake, it started kind of getting to me this idea of like, hey, CDP is digital analytics on steroids. It's digital analytics data with all of the other data, the store data, all the warehouse data. And then when I started being exposed to the idea of running warehouse native, like run on Snowflake and Databricks, that's where I started thinking, this is kind of really interesting. And I like the idea of looking at the full picture of the customer. I also really like this idea that the world is moving towards these cloud warehouses. And I'm like, how could I kind of learn more and dive into that? And then I found Hightouch, which actually does those two things together. And I'm like, okay, this kind of makes sense. And this would be an interesting area to learn about and explore. And that's what drew me to Hightouch.
Yeah, but then you kind of moved from the concept of you have been reading about kind of the data warehouse centric approach. But how was your learning experience from your first day at Hightouch? I mean, I remember one of your posts saying, that these are all the learnings from speaking to probably tens of people. I don't want to over exaggerate and say hundreds, but it must have been a few tens of people to teach you about the composable technology. How did that, did it further enhance your belief in that composable is a solid way forward? I know there's some contenders or some contention around the topic in the industry, but what was it for you that cemented saying, hey, composable is the way forward after your education tour at Hightouch, so to say?
Well, I'll say that my education started actually earlier. Because one of the benefits of being really old, like I am, is that I have lots of connections. Well, I'm a little older, but I have a pretty big network of people who've either read my book on Adobe Analytics or whatever. So I think I'm up to like 30,000 LinkedIn connections, and so I have a really good network. And over my career, I've helped a lot of people find jobs, kind of connect with others. And so one of the cool parts was that as I was kind of winding down at Amplitude and I knew that I wanted to do something different, but I wasn't sure what I wanted to do next, I started pinging people who I trusted. And once I started thinking about this kind of warehouse native composable CDP, there were a bunch of folks that I knew, friends of mine who work at Forrester and Gartner Group, friends who work at consulting firms. And I spent a lot of time just having conversations with them saying, what do you think? And what's interesting is some of them were gung ho, like, hey, I think composable is the future. Some of them were not. And I like to kind of get that balanced view. And so I then did a ton of research on my own and just kind of, met with people, read a lot of documents, read a lot of white papers. And at some point you have to just kind of make a decision and say, is this an area that you want to learn about? And I kind of look at your career as in general as like, if you're doing the same thing over and over again, like it gets kind of boring. And so it was a big deal for me to kind of walk away from 25 years worth of digital analytics.
Yeah.
But I'd say the biggest theme that I have in my career, as I look back at it, is that I always like to kind of be at a challenger brand, if you will. And it could either be a company or a philosophy. So like when we talked about web trends, when web trends was the 800-pound gorilla in the analytics space, I was like, you know what? I want to take a chance on a startup like Omniture, who I really have a good feeling about. And Omniture just destroyed web trends. When I worked at Salesforce, Oracle and Siebel were like the biggest vendors. But I really felt like Salesforce had a good thing going, and I felt like they were on the right path. When I joined Amplitude, I felt like they were doing really well in product analytics, and I felt like someone needed to kind of converge these different analytics disciplines. And when I reached out to a couple of vendors, Amplitude was the one that really wanted to do it. And now with Hightouch, I think they have such conviction around the composability that I felt like coming to Hightouch, I could bring my network to something and educate people around a newer technology that is really, I think, taking hold. Now, you never know what's going to win. Amplitude is doing great. Are they ever going to displace Adobe and Google? Probably not, but I think that if nothing else, I like to change either perceptions or change industry or change, the way people are thinking in an industry. And so if me coming to Hightouch puts a spotlight on composability and gets people talking about it more, then to me, that's a victory. And that's what I like, because I just like learning new things. And I could have made tons of money just continuing to fix bad Adobe Analytics implementations for the rest of my life. But I just eventually got bored of that because I just hate doing the same thing over and over. So, and I think a lot of people are like that.
Yeah, and I especially now with the current, kind of the shift, the change of focus within the market with the advent of AI. There's a lot of moving around in terms of interests with a lot of people in the industry. It was funny to see how many AI experts there were overnight when some of these things went mainstream. Apparently, people were they were learning for years to be experts. Two words that caught my attention when you were just talking are change of perception, that's 3, and the other one's education. And you recently told me that, in your opinion, because it was kind of a reply I gave to the post around I believe it was the ultimate guide or the ultimate research document that Hightouch published with the Martech Weekly. And you mentioned in one of your replies that it's a lot about education, and that in the opinion of probably Hightouch, definitely yourself, as you replied, a lot of companies don't really know about what composable actually is and what it is, and what the exact purpose is, or how it can be embedded into organizations that are probably already working with cloud data warehouses. And with you coming on board with Hightouch, I can fully understand now putting light onto that composable feature. But how is it, or not, sorry, feature, but framework, but in terms of education, what do you guys have in store? It's a big message to get out into the industry. What are some of the biggest questions you get around composable? The two that I always get is resources and latency. Those are the two topics that come up the most often when talking about composable.
Yeah. Well, there's a lot there. So let me cover a couple of different points. So first of all, one of the role that I have, and it's kind of a strange role, I'll admit, is called a product evangelist. And I have had this role. I really had it informally when I was at Omniture. I wrote a blog, and my blog had a lot of readership, and I spoke at all of our Omniture summits. Did similar role at Amplitude, where I spent a year in Europe speaking at conferences. And I think what it is when you have newer technology, whether it's, Omniture or web analytics or Amplitude and product analytics or Hightouch and composable CDP, there's always going to be industry experts, and I include you in that, who, know what's going on. You've got people like Scott Brinker and others who really understand what's happening in the landscape. But the weird thing I've learned is, especially at large organizations, things move really, really slowly. And while people get annoyed when you start hammering home, like, here's why composable is better than package. Like, I understand it could be annoying because you're like, okay, here it's like, they keep saying the same thing over and over. But I'll tell you that I met with a friend of mine who works at one of the largest financial firms in the world. He said, hey, I heard you had a new job. Why don't we have a chat and talk about it? And he said to me, he said, I've heard of CDPs, but I've never heard of the term composable CDP. What does that mean? And I almost fell off my chair, because he's a super savvy guy, been working at this financial firm for 20 years, but things just don't get through. And I think when you're on Twitter, when you're on, LinkedIn, you see this stuff over and over, but not many people live, especially if you're not a consultant or an analyst. And so I do think that there's a lot of education that's needed. Now, ironically, Hightouch has done an amazing job of putting content on their site. And one of the things we're proud of at Hightouch is we say that, even if you never bought our product, if you learned everything about, advertising or CDP, on our blog, that's still a win. And that you may be a customer 5-10 years from now. And so I'm a big believer that the more you put out, the more you give, the more you get. And so I think that there is a lot of education needed, because we're in the midst of a massive shift. And I think this massive shift is being masked a little bit because AI is, trumping everything. But if you think about it, 15 years ago, everyone was using in-house on-premise systems. Then we went to SaaS, and then there were hundreds of SaaS vendors. Then you have the marketing clouds like Adobe and Salesforce that acquired a bunch of them and made them into suites. And that made sense because it was hard to integrate all these tools. Well, then you now see this shift to the warehouse, and the warehouse is driving this whole composability movement, because once you have all of your data in the warehouse, then you can put point solutions around the warehouse for CRM, for your ESP, for your CDP, and they're all pivoting off of the warehouse. And we're in this world where I kind of feel like half of the world is kind of burying their head in the sand and saying, no, we actually like having our old way where we have our marketing suite and we put all our data in there and the marketers never have to talk to the data teams. And we like having this because we control it. Yeah. But obviously there's a lot of problems with that. And so I think that it's inevitable that we're moving to this warehouse world. And I think that's going to happen in parallel with this crazy AI phenomenon that we're seeing. But the reason why I think education is so important is, like, we would still be using web trends on premise if it wasn't for people like you mentioned, like Stefan Hamel, Eric Peterson, myself, other people who are shouting from the rooftops, no, you need to use SaaS. No, you need to use a digital analytics tool. Like, it took, I can't tell you how many educational posts there were back in the day. We just didn't see as much of it because we didn't have as much of LinkedIn and Twitter and so on. And so, long way of saying, I think education is really important. And I think that major change doesn't happen that often. I think the internet was a big change. I think mobile was a big change. I think the warehouse is a big change. I think AI is a big change. And I think that it takes a long time to get people to move from the old way to the new way.
Yeah, no, definitely. I mean, even Scott Brinker with Martech's law, in which he states that the company's adaptability to new technology, or at least the growth at which new technology grows, outpaces that companies can keep up with. And I think that plays a huge role. You also mentioned control. That's a huge topic now, especially around AI. How are they going to change things that are already in place and seem working? It's a tough nut to crack. And I didn't know you were doing the blog for so many years. And it's funny that you mentioned it, because you still today, I think I got into the technical side of digital analytics over 10 years ago now because of poor data quality. And the funny thing is, now we have that monumental shift, as you noted, around AI, and it's only exposing that even further. Does that data quality pose a threat to composable CDPs, or at least not necessarily the CDP part, but just the data warehouse?
Yeah, so I don't think so, but I think obviously there's growing pains whenever you move to a new technology. And here's how I look at it: is every organization wants to have one data set with the cleanest, best customer data. I mean, no one is going to argue. Everyone wants that. But the question is, how do you get there? And I think that data teams have emerged as the team that really is focused on collecting the right data, the right events, verifying its quality, and so on. Now, marketers a lot of times have outsourced that to packaged CDPs and said, listen, we're going to hire your professional services. We're going to get your data in. But I think what tends to happen is that you end up with a different data set in, say, your packaged CDP than what you have in the warehouse. And I think that
schemas
and I think the schemas are pretty complex in the warehouse, and obviously the schemas in packaged CDPs are a little more limiting. But I think that in general, the problem I have with the packaged approach is just that how are you going to keep the latest and greatest data in the packaged CDP that's driven by marketers when the world is moving? I mean, data is the biggest asset of most companies nowadays. And so companies are putting so much investment in making sure that your data is going to be good in the warehouse. Why wouldn't you want to piggyback off of that? So I think that data quality can be good or bad in the warehouse or in a packaged CDP. But I think that in the long run, the best data quality is going to be in the warehouse, because of the warehouse is used not only for CDP, but for so many other business functions like executive reporting through BI, so many other transactional things that I just think my bet is on the warehouse having the best set of data. And then you only have two options. You either have to then find a way to keep the warehouse data in sync with data in a packaged CDP, or you go to the composable model that just uses the data that's in the warehouse. But I think that the silo approach of marketers thinking that they have the best customer data in a packaged CDP that's better than the warehouse, I just don't think that's going to last. And I think that there's a lot of work that has to be done to have data quality. And if you do end up having these two silos, you have to actually do that work twice or find a way to integrate it between the two. And I don't think anyone is going to say, we're going to make our data really good in the package CDP and then send that to the warehouse. I think it's just more logical to go the other way around.
Yeah. That interesting. That opens up a whole new other can of worms. The one I want to kind of come back to you on is I think it goes back to what was the point you made? Oh yeah, around being on LinkedIn and being up to date with the newest of the newest, and it's a great area to be in. But if you indeed look into the workforce or the companies that are trying to broaden their horizons around marketing technology, and I need to kind of put the quotes around marketing because, as you duly stated, I mean, it's more than just marketing, isn't it? Is that also a part of education around cloud data warehousing that needs to be tackled alongside what the capabilities could be around it? It's, for instance, a lot of the, I think I spoke to Nate about this, and he said, yeah, we do focus mostly around enterprise. Mid-market is always there as well. But I think mid-market is the place that is struggling. I mean, Enterprise have the money. They invest in people, they invest in technology, and they're able to take a lead. What are some advices you can give to mid-market companies who say, hey, this is interesting. They've seen you present, they've heard about Hightouch, and they say, we want to get on board with this, but where do we start? We don't have the resources. Yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean, in general, predominantly a company like Hightouch is focused on the enterprise. We have tons of kind of more, I'd say, mid-market companies, but we definitely do cater more towards that enterprise. But I think the common theme for us is, do you have a workable cloud warehouse that you've invested in, that you have data in, that you trust? And I think the truth is just that more enterprises have made that shift over to, whether that's, Snowflake, Databricks, Google, you name it, they've made that movement. And I think you see this in general. What's ironic is that the digital native organizations have actually gone first. Then kind of the large organizations have followed, and then you start to see mid-market after that. It's kind of weird because you think like digital natives are the smallest company. You'd think it would go smallest to medium to enterprise. But in this case, what I've seen most often is it's kind of digital native to enterprise to mid-market. But there are so many opportunities for mid-market companies to spin up a warehouse. You could even kind of rent a warehouse in order to get going. But I think that there are a lot of organizations in the mid-market that just aren't there yet. And they're, still using, weird kind of point solutions or, smaller vendors that, kind of own most of their customer data. But I think that's going to go away. I think we're just seeing that the warehouse is going to kind of take over. So it's not that Hightouch has a bias for enterprise over mid-market. It's just, as a composable solution, we rely on an organization having the data readiness to be able to use our tools. And so there's plenty of companies that have made the shift to the warehouse that we speak to. And ironically, if there's companies that haven't, we spend an enormous amount of time, I think actually too much time sometimes, working with companies to educate them and help them to move over to the cloud, even though like that means they're probably not going to be a customer of ours for a year. But we believe that gives us goodwill, so that once they're kind of a year later and they've listened to us, then they might be a future customer of ours.
Yeah, there's definitely no shortage of goodwill at Hightouch. I even saw you guys working with a university, or was it a college recently, that you went and you taught about composable technologies?
Yeah, I mean, we do that all the time. And our founders, have been kind of on the forefront of composability. So they're always out there doing that. But one other thing I'll throw in there is, in today's landscape, everyone's looking for jobs and employers always looking for people to hire. And one thing to think about, and I bring this up to a lot of people and they don't really think about it until I mention it, is that for many years in SaaS, people like me and others, our biggest skill was that we knew a particular software product. Like I knew Omniture or Adobe. There are people that know package CDPs really, really well. But I think that what organizations are starting to see is they want people who understand the warehouse, who understand Snowflake, Databricks, who understand SQL, because if you know those things, you can work with hundreds of vendors. And I think that a lot of consultants and research firms, I think have invested too much in who a particular vendor is. And I'll pick on Telium because we mentioned them earlier. I think that if you are a Telium expert, like that's great, but what is the shelf life of a Telium expert? Or if you have Telium, like if you're looking to hire a Telium expert, there's really small pool. But I think if you say, I need a Snowflake expert or a Databricks or a cloud expert, like you're starting to see, if you look at indeed.com, thousands of people will come back. And I think that that's where the industry tends to go, because employers want people that they can hire. And then if you're looking for a job, you're probably going to spend more time learning things that will help you with the cloud, because that will give you like 50 different job opportunities versus learning Adobe Analytics or learning Telium. I think the age of being an expert in one package is going away.
Yeah, I can definitely vouch for that. I actually did a study for a client of mine one time. Some research. They said, do we shift to, and this is, I don't know, 10 years ago as well, 9 years. They said, do we shift to Google Stack or do we stick with Adobe Analytics and Telium? And I think the end advice that I did give, and it was based on something on a job website, like you said, you mentioned Indeed. At the time with Google's open community, it's very much about, let's help each other out to make sure that we can get this product working. So the advice went to, it'd be worth considering going to the Google stack, because when you compared it to the Telium Adobe stack, you often get locked into agencies. That's where the people are that are very tool focused, in that sense that they get the training, because sometimes they can be expensive. I know I did have a look at Trailhead for, was it Trailhead? Yeah, for Salesforce. That was wild. Those pricings, I think it's over $2,000 just to get one, to do one course.
Yeah, and it's funny because I actually the biggest culprit, because for many years I was a tool guy. Like I was known as the Omniture guy. My nickname was Omni-Man, or the Adobe Analytics guy. And I think that's why people were a little confused when I went to Amplitude and then when I went to Hightouch, because I actually don't believe that you should be tied to a tool.
Yeah.
But you should be tied to like a platform or a type of technology.
The underlying technology potentially, yeah, and that's interesting you say that, because Databricks just recently made a big move with data intelligence for marketing, and Hightouch was one of those launch partners for it. Is it also that with these kind of platforms, the relationships with vendors like Databricks and Snowflake fully flourish for the composable market?
Yeah, I mean, when I say we Hightouch, we make companies like Snowflake, Databricks, Google better. Ironically, and most people won't understand this, but I'm actually going to be writing some blog posts about this, is we actually make the big marketing suites better. We make Salesforce better. We make Adobe Cloud better, because some of the top destinations of Hightouch is to Adobe and Salesforce. And so we actually think we're very additive. And so a lot of the cloud providers, we're kind of all in lockstep on composability, obviously, because it helps us and it helps them. And I think that's why we're kind of seeing I think that the thing over the next 5 years besides AI is going to be who's going to win the kind of closed packaged marketing clouds, or is it going to be more of the open composable? And I actually have a blog post that's coming out soon where I'm talking about the next wave, which is what I call micro composability, because I actually think we're going even further in the composability direction, because I think that a lot of products are going to be broken up even further. And I'll give you like one example.
Does that tie into the state of Martech's microtail that they were talking
about? Yeah, exactly. And I've actually been working with Franz and Scott a little bit about this. And Franz actually gave me a diagram that I could use for my blog post. Because if you think about it, let's just use an example. Many years ago, let's say you're using Salesforce and you're using everything in Salesforce. And one of the things you're using is their email tool. Well, the composable world would say, hey, if Braze or Iterable is better than Salesforce's email tool, you should be able to use that and just plug it into Salesforce. And that's kind of the whole model, use the best of breed. Well, a couple months ago, Hightouch came out with a feature called AI decisioning, which helps do personalized email using AI and machine learning to help have better messages within an email. So that works with Salesforce Marketing Cloud, with Braze, with Iterable. So if you think about it, you could actually use AI decisioning to do better personalization within Braze or Iterable or Salesforce's email tool, Salesforce Marketing Cloud. Then that folds into the Salesforce Marketing Cloud. So 5 years ago, you might have used Salesforce for everything. Then maybe 2 years ago, you had two vendors, Salesforce and Iterable. Well, now you're using Salesforce, Iterable, and Hightouch AI decisioning. So like you kind of see how things have the potential to keep being broken down into best of breed within a best of breed. And I think that's where we're going versus the monolithic, you trust one vendor for everything. And some companies are going to love the monolithic approach because legally and procurement wise, it's easy. But I think ultimately, how is a monolithic marketing suite going to compete if there's 50 functions underneath them? How are they going to be the best at all of those 50 functions? And now that it's so much easier to integrate with APIs and so on, you could use the best of breed. And I just think this composability could keep going further and further.
Yeah. Well, one thing that I maybe it's not going to happen, but something that I wish would happen, and I think would really spark off an adoption of this technology. I mean, what are your thoughts around usage-based pricing? That you just pay for what you use. It's something that I'm seeing in a few of these newer kind of marketing technology startup tools. Is it something that you think would be worthwhile?
Yeah, I mean, I can't speak pricing wise for Hightouch.
No,
That's
of
not my
course.
area. But yeah, I mean, we are seeing that. For example, there are some of the companies we compete with that charge by, say, profile, like user
Yeah,
profile, which actually is kind of strange because
horrible.
you're saying to your customer, if we are successful and help you get more customers, then you have to pay us more. And so like Hightouch actually prices a little differently, especially for our main customer studio and our reverse ETL, we charge more on syncs, but we want to have positive incentives and not charge you for, being successful in your business. So I do think usage, and I think a lot of this is going towards compute usage. And that's why there's a whole industry built up right now of consulting firms that help you kind of optimize your compute. But I think storage is becoming cheap. And what's interesting is a lot of the old guard vendors are charging based on storage or profile. And I think that's just an antiquated way of thinking about it. And I think compute and usage is kind of where the industry is going.
Yeah. No, definitely. I think because I've seen it with it, like I mentioned, with a few startups that are really focusing on not necessarily the mom and pop stores, but definitely the ones who seem to have a strong business online, but just don't have the funds to go for one of the more high end tools. And there were a few companies last year who said, yeah, we can do credit based. You buy a number of credits and you can apply them to the features. As you mentioned, if you have 50 features, you can apply them to the features that you want to use them to. So in terms of Hightouch, what is it that you could potentially talk about right now at the end of May that we can be looking forward to? Because I think the journey, correct me if I'm wrong, was it the journey tester or the journey that was just released to see how your orchestration flow would result in?
Journey simulation. Yep.
Journey simulation. I mentioned on LinkedIn, that is like one of those tools that you didn't know you needed until you had it. Being able to test out that flow with the data that you have, or at least the underlying profiles that you have. Are there any more fun stuff like that coming out in, let's say, just before the summer? Because I hope you guys are taking a break because you guys are doing a lot.
Well, I can tell you we are not taking a break. I wish there was more I can tell you, and I think we're going to have to maybe do a follow-up because this summer and fall are going to be released. We're going to be releasing the coolest features that I have seen in the CDP space that I wish I could tell you more about. We are going to be breaking down some barriers and some kind of preconceived notions about what is possible in a composable world. So I would tell you, just stay tuned.
Sounds like an intro for a Netflix series.
Yeah, I mean, for now, the journey simulations is really cool. We've just updated some really cool stuff with identity resolution with Golden Record. And for us right now, our AI decisioning is one of our hottest products right now because so many people are just sending emails to thousands of people at a time and maybe doing one or two kind of A/B tests. But imagine being able to have 1,000 different versions of email, different permutations sent at different time using AI to improve that. And one of the coolest things that we found with our AI decisioning product is not only does it improve messaging lift rates, and conversion, but also the amount of learnings that our customers are getting behind the scenes. It's almost like every email that they send teaches them a little bit more about their customers, whether that's different products that they didn't know that they should be cross-selling together. And so we're starting to expose all of that and then save that back into the warehouse. And we've had a number of customers who've told us that in addition to lift and better conversion, that actually the learnings is just as important. And so we're really excited about this. And as we start seeing AI get more advanced, imagine being able to have a world where you say, here's a bunch of creatives, here's a bunch of images, here's a bunch of things that we want to send to customers, but not only have it personalized one-to-one, but also choose the channel and say, this person should get a promo on their homepage of the website. This one should get a push message. This one should get an email. This customer, we actually might want to buy an ad on Google because they're that valuable to us. And when you have access to all of the customer data, including lifetime value in the warehouse, and then you combine that with AI, it's almost like you can be a virtual marketer and let the AI choose the channel and the message and let you kind of just make sure you're really on top of the guardrails and kind of tweaking things and making sure that, you have the right creative, the right images, the right offers. And so we're really excited because the technology that we built is kind of leaning towards where AI is going, especially when we get into the model context protocols. Like that's what I'm most excited about, because now I hate to say it, but in some cases, humans do become a barrier. And so once we can get into MCP, I think you're going to start seeing some really cool things.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I remember somebody telling me the other day, CDP investment rounds and CDPs have all kind of dried up. Hightouch did do an 80 billion one, but it was actually for a non-related CDP product, was for AI decisioning. So it'll be interesting to see where that market is going to go right now for a lot of these vendors and how they're going to continue to develop their AI capabilities. But you guys got off to a flying start.
Yep.
Adam, thank you so much for your time today. And I hope we can catch up after the summer for these mystery features that are being worked on most likely during the holidays, and see what kind of barriers we can break down even further around composable.
Well, thanks so much for having me. I'm happy to come back anytime. This is what I do for a living, so it's really fun. So thanks so much.
Yeah, it was great talking to you. It's better than those support messages from 20 years ago.
No EVARs and S props here.
Talk to you later.
Thanks so much. Thanks.
Bye.